My name is Claire, and I was 34 years old the December my mother called to tell me not to come home for Christmas. She didn't say it that way, of course. What she said was, "Your Aunt Roberta is visiting this year, and you know how complicated that gets. It might just be easier if we keep it small." And then, after a pause that I understood completely, "You understand, don't you, Claire? You always understand." I said that I did. I hung up. I sat in my apartment in Kansas City for a while, and then I went downstairs and knocked on my neighbor Deja's door, and I said, "Do you and the kids want company for Christmas dinner?" And she said yes, without asking a single question about why I was offering. What my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, because my grandmother had never told anyone, was that 6 months before that phone call, Grandma Loretta had sat down with her estate attorney and sealed an envelope. She had given him one instruction about when to open it. The instruction had a date attached to it. The date was the annual family business meeting the following April. And when that envelope came open in a conference room with 12 people in it, what the attorney read aloud changed everything my aunt had been quietly arranging for the previous 3 years. I'll tell you what was inside. But first I want to tell you about my grandmother because without her, none of the rest of it makes any sense. Welcome back to Chenille, where quiet people have the last word without raising their voice. If you've ever been told you understand just a little too conveniently, drop a comment and hit subscribe. New story every week. There is a particular thing people say to the person in a family who has learned to absorb disappointment without making a scene. They say, "You understand." They say it the way you'd say it to someone you trust completely, warmly even, but what they mean, underneath the warmth, is, you won't cause a problem. You won't push back. You won't ask for an explanation. You will nod and adjust and make space the way you always have because that is who you are, and everyone has come to depend on it. My name is Claire Weston. I am a licensed landscape architect based in Kansas City, Missouri. I was 34 years old the December my mother called to suggest, in the gentlest possible language, that I skip Christmas. I want to tell you the whole shape of it, how it started, how it accumulated, and how it ended in a conference room on an April morning with 12 members of my family sitting around a table and an attorney reading a single handwritten condition aloud into the silence. But to understand why that moment landed the way it did, you need to understand my grandmother first. Loretta Weston, my father's mother, known to the family as Gran, was 81 years old when this story begins, and she was one of those people who seem to have been born already knowing things that take everyone else decades to learn. She had grown up in rural Missouri, the second daughter of a farmer and a schoolteacher, and she had spent her adult life building and managing a small but remarkably durable family business, Weston Property Holdings, a collection of 12 commercial rental properties across 2 counties that she and my grandfather had assembled over 40 years, one careful acquisition at a time. My grandfather, Harold, had died 11 years before the events of this story. He had been a steady, deliberate man who deferred to Gran on nearly every significant decision, not from weakness, but from the accurate assessment that she was almost always right. After his death, Gran had continued managing the portfolio herself until her early 70s, when she had brought in a property management firm to handle the day-to-day operations. She retained the board seat. She attended the annual meeting every April, without exception. She knew the name of every tenant in every building. The business itself was structured as a family LLC. The members were Gran, my father David, my Aunt Roberta, Gran's daughter, my father's younger sister, and, since my grandfather's death, a small advisory interest held on paper by the third generation, which in practice meant me and my cousin Steph, Roberta's daughter. The annual April meeting was required by the operating agreement and had been held every year without significant drama for over a decade. Gran lived in the house in Bellevale where she had raised her children, a large, well-maintained Victorian on a corner lot, 12 miles from Kansas City, with a covered front porch she used from April through October and a kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee and whatever she'd been baking. I had spent every significant holiday of my childhood in that house. I had learned to make pie crust at that kitchen counter. I had done homework at that table and argued about books on that porch and cried, once, after a bad breakup in the small back bedroom that had been my father's as a boy. It was not just a building. It was the organizing center of the family's emotional geography. And Gran was the person who made it that. My father, David Weston, was 61 and worked in commercial insurance. He was a gentle, somewhat conflict-averse man who loved his family sincerely and had a lifelong habit of taking the path of least resistance when his wife and his sister were pulling in opposite directions. His wife, my mother, Sandra, was organized, socially precise, and deeply attentive to the question of how the family appeared from the outside. She had always gotten along with Gran, in the polished, slightly effortful way that daughters-in-law sometimes manage with mothers-in-law who are more formidable than they are. Aunt Roberta was 57. She was the younger child and had occupied that position in the family's emotional architecture with remarkable consistency for her entire adult life, which is to say that she had a particular skill for making her needs feel like the family's needs, for framing her preferences as practical considerations, and for describing her choices as being, ultimately, in everyone's best interest. She was not a cruel person. She was a strategic one, in the way that people who have always had to advocate for themselves within a family system become strategic without quite realizing it. Roberta's daughter Steph was 29, sweet-natured, and almost entirely under her mother's influence in anything that pertained to the family business or Gran's care. Steph had moved back to Belleville 3 years before this story begins, ostensibly to help look after Gran, which was a genuine contribution and also, it turned out, a convenient arrangement for other reasons. I had moved to Kansas City at 26 for a graduate program in landscape architecture and had stayed for work. My firm, a mid-sized practice that did a mix of municipal and private projects, had kept me busy and moderately well compensated for 8 years. I owned my apartment. I drove a 7-year-old Subaru with a cracked rear bumper that I kept meaning to fix. I had a small, close set of friends, a client roster I was proud of, and a professional reputation that I had built entirely through competence and consistency. What I did not have, in the years leading up to this story, was much of a foothold in my own family. This had not always been true. When I was younger, in my teens and early 20s, before Roberta's marriage ended and before Steph moved back to Belleville, the family dynamics had been different. I had been close with Gran. I had spent summers in her house, helping with the garden, listening to her talk about the properties and the tenants and the original logic behind each acquisition. She had a gift for explaining financial structures in plain language, and she had spent a lot of time explaining them to me, in the way a teacher does when they've identified a student who is actually listening. I remember a conversation we had on the back porch the summer I was 22, the summer before I left for graduate school. She was talking about the LLC operating agreement, which was being updated that year, and she said something that I have thought about many times since. The people who manage things over the long term are the ones who understand what they're managing, not the ones who are present the most or the loudest or the most convenient, the ones who've done the work of understanding. I didn't know then that she was telling me something specific. I thought she was talking about the business in general. I was 22 and I was leaving, and I was mostly thinking about what came next. It took me 12 more years to understand what she'd been saying. The shift in the family's gravity began, from my vantage point, roughly 3 years before the Christmas phone call, when Roberta's marriage finally, officially ended after a long and expensive dissolution, and Roberta sold her house in St. Louis and moved back to Belleville. She bought a place 4 blocks from Gran's house. Steph followed within 6 months. The official narrative was that they were returning to support Gran, who was getting older and whose health, while generally stable, warranted having family nearby. This was not false. Gran was 80 at that point and did benefit from having people close. What the narrative didn't mention was that Roberta had emerged from her divorce in somewhat reduced financial circumstances and that the Weston LLC, over which Gran still held controlling interest, had become correspondingly more significant to her planning for the future. None of this was stated openly. It didn't need to be. It arranged itself in the way these things do, through proximity, through small daily decisions, through who was at Gran's table for Sunday dinner and who was not. I was in Kansas City. I visited for major holidays and Gran's birthday in September and the occasional long weekend when a project brought me close enough to justify the drive. I called Gran every week, without fail, every Sunday morning, 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes longer if she was in a talking mood. We discussed the properties. We discussed my projects. We discussed books. She asked precise questions about my work and remembered the answers the next time we spoke. I did not notice, at first, that my access to Gran was being managed. It happened slowly. A Sunday call where Gran seemed tired and asked to keep it short, which happened, legitimately, sometimes. A birthday visit where Roberta was there the entire time, and the conversation never quite settled into the register Gran and I usually found together. A missed month of calls because Gran had had a respiratory infection and Steph said she needed rest. All individually reasonable. All, in retrospect, part of a pattern that I was not paying enough attention to see. What I was paying attention to was work. I had landed a significant municipal contract that year, a redesign of a public park system in the Westport neighborhood, and the project had absorbed the kind of focused energy that makes you look up and realize 6 months have passed. By the time I looked up, Roberta was at Gran's house 3 or 4 days a week. Steph had a key. The Sunday calls were shorter. And when I visited for Thanksgiving that year, the Thanksgiving before the Christmas phone call, there was a quality to the visit that I hadn't felt before. A slight rearrangement. Not hostile, not overt, just the subtle, pervasive sense of having arrived in a room where the furniture has been shifted slightly and no one mentions it. The Christmas call came on a Wednesday evening in early December. I was at my drafting table, working late on planting plans for a private residential project, when my mother's number came up. She began with a few minutes of ordinary conversation. Work, weather, my father's back, which had been troubling him. Then she shifted gears with the particular smoothness she has always brought to difficult messages. "We wanted to let you know about Christmas," she said. "Your Aunt Roberta is coming down and she's bringing stuff, of course, and she mentioned that she's hoping to spend some real time with Gran this year. You know how it's been since the divorce. It's been hard on her. And with everything this year, your father, and I thought it might be nice to keep it a bit contained. Just the immediate group." I asked what that meant. "Well, Roberta is really immediate family," my mother said.
"And Steph.
"And they've been so present for Gran this year. We just think it would be easier. You know how complicated it gets with everyone there." I said, "I'm immediate family too." There was a pause. Not a long one, my mother is too composed for long pauses, but I felt its shape. Then, "Of course you are, Claire. But you know how Roberta can be when she feels crowded. And you've always been so understanding about these things. Your aunt needs this more right now, you know? You understand." There it was. The phrase, in its full deployment. I said, "I understand." Because what else do you say in the moment to something that is presented as reasonable from every angle and that, somewhere below the solar plexus, is not reasonable at all? I hung up. I put my pencil down. I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a while. Then I went downstairs. My downstairs neighbor was Deja Monroe, 31, a licensed practical nurse who worked rotating shifts at a pediatric clinic and was raising 3 kids, Marcus, 9, Amara, 7, and the baby Theo, who was not quite 2, largely on her own since her ex had relocated to Denver for work. Deja was efficient, warm, and almost constitutionally incapable of self-pity. We had become friends over 4 years of shared building life in the way that people who have both chosen the same slightly inconvenient but good building become friends, through small persistent proximity, borrowed eggs, packages signed for, and the occasional conversation that went longer than expected. I knocked on her door, and when she answered I said, "Do you and the kids have plans for Christmas?" She looked at me for a moment with the specific look she uses when she understands something is happening, but has decided not to ask about it yet. Then she said, "I was going to do a roast chicken. The kids want pie." "I can make pie," I said. "Then you should come down," she said. We spent Christmas in her apartment. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, 2 pies, Marcus showing me a card game he'd invented, Amara narrating the entire plot of a book she'd recently read, Theo carrying a wooden block from room to room with great purpose. Deja made mulled cider that smelled like the whole holiday season compressed into a single scent. We didn't discuss why I wasn't somewhere else. It was one of the better Christmases I can remember. Not because it was grand, because it was entirely without performance. January brought back the ordinary business of work and winter and the low-grade, Persistent awareness that something in my family had shifted past inconvenience into something I didn't have a clean name for yet. I called Gran on the first Sunday of the new year. Steph answered Gran's phone, which was new. She said Gran was resting and would call back. Gran called back 4 days later on a Thursday morning, and the call lasted 6 minutes and had a quality of constraint, I can only call it, that I had not heard before. Gran asked about my projects. I asked about her health. She said she was fine. She said the winter had been tiring. She said she was glad to hear my voice. That last thing she said in a particular way, with a slight emphasis, a slight pressure on the word glad, that made something in me go very still. As if she was communicating something around the edges of the conversation that the conversation itself didn't have room for. I told her I'd call next Sunday. She said good. We hung up. I sat with that call for the rest of the day. In February, I called my father. Not my mother, my father, which I do less often because the calls are shorter and less revealing, but occasionally produce something true. I asked him directly how Gran was doing. He said she was well, considering. I asked him how often he was getting out to Bellevale. He said every couple of weeks. Roberta had really taken on a lot of the day-to-day, and it had been a relief to have her close. I asked if Gran seemed happy to have Roberta close. There was a pause. My father's pauses are different from my mother's, less composed, more genuinely searching. Then he said, she seems settled. Quieter than usual, maybe. But she's 81, Claire. Has she said anything about the business? I asked. About the April meeting? Nothing specific, he said. Roberta's been going over some of the property management costs with her. Talking about consolidating a couple of the leases. Streamlining. Gran seems amenable. Something in my chest did a slow, cold movement. Not panic, more like recognition arriving ahead of understanding. I said, is the operating agreement being amended? My father sounded slightly surprised by the specificity of the question. I don't know the details, he said. Roberta's been handling most of the prep for the April meeting. I'm sure we'll go through everything then. I said, I'd like to be at the April meeting. Another pause. Of course, he said. You're a member. You're always welcome. He didn't ask why I'd felt the need to say it. I didn't explain. In March, I called Gran's attorney. His name was Douglas Firth, and he had handled Gran's estate planning for over 20 years. I had met him twice, once at a family meeting when I was in my mid-20s, and once briefly at my grandfather's funeral. He was a careful, gray-haired man in his late 60s who communicated exclusively in precise, non-committal professional language, and who had the quality of someone who has been trusted with significant things for a long time and takes that trust seriously. I called his office and left a message saying I was Loretta Weston's granddaughter, that I was a member of the Weston Family LLC, and that I had some questions about the April annual meeting. He called back the same afternoon, which I noted. He could not, he explained, discuss Gran's personal estate planning with me. He said this clearly but without coldness, the statement of a boundary rather than a rejection. What he could tell me, he said, was that the annual LLC meeting was scheduled for April 14th at his offices, that my attendance as a member was not only welcome but advisable, and that the agenda for the meeting had some items on it that I would want to be present to hear. He paused after that last sentence. A deliberate pause. The kind a careful person uses when they want to draw attention to something without saying it directly. I said, is there anything I should prepare for? He said, I would simply recommend you be there, Ms. Weston. In person if at all possible. I booked the day off work. I confirmed my attendance in writing. I did not tell my parents I had called Douglas Firth. I did not mention the call to anyone. The weeks between March and April had a particular quality. The feeling of waiting for something you can't see clearly, but can sense with enough resolution to know it's coming. I went about my work. I finished the Westport Park planting plans and moved into implementation oversight. I had Sunday dinner with a friend. I helped Deja with her taxes because she hated doing them. I ran the river trail in the cold mornings. I did not call Roberta. I had no reason to, in the ordinary course of things, and I didn't manufacture one. What I did do in the weeks before the meeting was review everything I could access about the Weston LLC operating agreement. I had a copy on file from when I'd been added to the advisory interest years earlier. I read it carefully, the way you read something when you've decided that understanding it matters. I looked up Missouri LLC statutes. I refreshed my understanding of what a controlling member could and couldn't do unilaterally, and what required a vote. I was an urban planner, not an attorney, but I had spent 8 years reading zoning codes and land use regulations, and I knew how to parse legal documents. What I found, reading the operating agreement, was that certain amendments, specifically amendments affecting member interests, required a 2/3 vote of the membership, which in practice meant that Gran and at least one other member had to agree. Gran's controlling interest alone was not sufficient for those changes. And I found something else. A clause in the original agreement drafted in 1999 that Gran and my grandfather had insisted on, one I hadn't noticed before or hadn't thought about before, an anti-dilution provision that protected the advisory interests of third-generation members from any amendment that would reduce their economic rights without their written consent. My written consent, which no one had asked for. I printed that page. I put it in a folder. I said nothing to anyone. The April meeting was held on a Thursday morning at Douglas Firth's offices in downtown Belleville, a modest professional building on the main commercial street, clean and quiet, with a conference room that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. I arrived at 9:40, 20 minutes before the scheduled 10 o'clock start. The receptionist confirmed my name, offered coffee, and showed me to the conference room. The room had a long oval table with 8 chairs. I was the first one there. By 10 o'clock, the room had filled. Gran was at the head of the table, which was her customary position, and she looked smaller than I expected, and also completely alert. Her posture was precise. Her hands were folded on the table. She was wearing a blue cardigan I recognized from a dozen Sunday visits. When I came in, she looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not surprise. Something more like satisfaction. The way someone looks when a calculation has come out the way they expected. Roberta was on Gran's right. She was dressed for the meeting in a way that communicated authority. Dark blazer, reading glasses on a chain, a notepad already covered with preparation notes. She looked up when I walked in, and her expression did something that took less than a second to complete. A flash of surprise, then a rapid smoothing. She said pleasantly, "Claire, I didn't know you were coming." "I'm a member," I said. "I try to attend." She nodded, still pleasant. "Of course." Steph was beside Roberta, and Steph's face was less controlled. She looked at me with something that landed differently than her mother's composed greeting. Something closer to the look of a person who has been told a particular version of a story and is suddenly aware there may be another one. My father was across the table, beside my mother. He looked relieved when I walked in, which told me something. He hadn't known I was coming, and he was glad I was there. He gave me the particular nod he uses when he's saying something he can't say out loud. Douglas Firth was at the far end of the table, beside his paralegal. He had a folder in front of him and a plain white business envelope on top of it, sealed, with Gran's handwriting on the front. I could read the front from my seat. To be opened at the April meeting. L. Weston. The date on the envelope, written in Gran's forward slanting hand, was March 14th of the previous year. 13 months ago. Gran had written that date and sealed that envelope 13 months ago, and had not mentioned it to anyone in this room. I looked at it. I looked at Gran. She was looking at Douglas Firth. Douglas Firth called the meeting to order. The meeting proceeded through its standard items with professional efficiency: the property management report, the financial summary, the lease renewal schedule. Roberta had clearly prepared extensively and spoke with the confident fluency of someone who has spent a year positioning themselves as the operational authority in the room. She proposed 2 lease consolidations and a refinancing of one of the commercial notes, both of which she framed as straightforward cost reduction measures. My father nodded along. Steph made notes. Gran listened without expression. I asked 3 questions during the financial review, each precise, each grounded in the operating agreement language I had reviewed the previous month. Roberta answered them smoothly. But I noticed, and I think Douglas Firth noticed, that Gran's eyes moved to me each time I spoke, with the specific quality of a teacher watching a student demonstrate something they'd been taught. Then Roberta raised the item I had been waiting for, though I hadn't known exactly what shape it would take until she said it. She proposed an amendment to the operating agreement. The amendment would restructure the advisory member interests, mine and Steph's, converting them from economic interests to purely nominal positions with no claim on distributions. The practical effect would be to concentrate all economic rights in the three primary members, Gran, my father, and Roberta herself, while Steph, as Roberta's heir apparent, would eventually inherit Roberta's share directly. I, effectively, would be written out. Roberta presented this as a simplification, a modernization of an agreement that had been drafted in 1999 and hadn't kept pace with the business's evolution. She said it with the tone of someone describing a minor administrative update. My father looked at the table. He did not look at me. I said calmly, I'd like to note for the record that this amendment would require my written consent under the anti-dilution clause in Article 7, Section C. I haven't provided that consent, and I'm not prepared to. Roberta looked at me. A stillness moved across her face, the kind that precedes a very careful response. She said, the anti-dilution clause applies to economic interests as they were originally defined. The legal interpretation is that a conversion to nominal status doesn't trigger it. I'd be interested in hearing Douglas Firth's view on that, I said. Everyone looked at Douglas Firth. Douglas Firth said, with the measured precision of someone who has been waiting for this moment, before we proceed to that question, there is one item remaining on the agenda. He placed his hand on the white envelope. Mrs. Weston provided this to my office last March with instructions to open it at this meeting, in the presence of all members. With her permission, I'll do that now. He looked at Gran. Gran said, please. Douglas Firth opened the envelope. He unfolded a single page, one sheet, handwritten, with a notary's seal at the bottom. He read it aloud. The document was a letter of instruction, attached to a codicil Gran had added to her estate plan the previous March. The codicil itself was a separate legal instrument, already filed, already in effect. The letter explained its contents in Gran's own words, for the benefit of everyone in the room. The codicil established that upon Gran's death, control of the Weston LLC would pass not to the existing primary members in equal shares, as the prior estate plan had specified, but according to a weighted distribution that reflected demonstrated stewardship of the business. The weights had been defined by Gran herself, based on her own assessment, and were documented in a supplemental schedule attached to the codicil. The single condition that governed the distribution, the member who had maintained consistent engagement with the business, attending meetings, asking informed questions, reviewing the operating agreement, demonstrating understanding of the portfolio, would receive the controlling interest. The supplemental schedule named one person in that role. Douglas Firth read my name aloud. He said it in the same unhurried, uninflected tone he'd used for everything else on the agenda. He set the page down. He looked at the room. The room did not move. My father's hand, which had been resting on the table, went still, completely still, in the way hands go still when the body is absorbing something faster than the mind can process it. Steph's pen had stopped. Roberta was looking at the page in Douglas Firth's hands with an expression I can only describe as the color going out of something, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a slow, thorough draining, like watching a room lose its light when the sun moves. Gran was looking at me. I looked back at her. Her expression was composed and warm and entirely unsurprised, in the way of someone who has known for a long time exactly how a story ends. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that the document hadn't already said with more authority than anything I could produce. Douglas Firth noted for the record that the codicil had been executed on March 14th of the previous year, witnessed and notarized, and was currently on file with his office and with the county. He noted that the amendment Roberta had proposed would, in light of the codicil's conditions, require careful review before any vote could be taken. He suggested the meeting take a brief recess. My father said, "Yes. I think that's yes." The recess lasted 23 minutes. I got coffee from the reception area and stood near the window that looked out onto the street. I watched the traffic. A woman walked past with a dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Ordinary April morning in a mid-sized Missouri town. Deja had texted me that morning, Let me know how it goes. I hadn't told her specifics, only that there was a meeting I was nervous about. I texted back, I'll tell you tonight. When the meeting resumed, the amendment was tabled. Roberta requested more time to review the legal implications. Douglas Firth agreed that further review was appropriate. My father said nothing of substance, but agreed with the tabling in a tone that made it clear he had understood, in the recess, something he had not understood before. Gran voted to table alongside my father. The amendment died. Afterward, in the parking lot, my father found me at my car. He stood for a moment without speaking, which is what he does when he is trying to organize something complicated into words. She told you, he said finally. Not a question. She told me to pay attention, I said. About 12 years ago. I finally understood what she meant. He looked at his hands. I didn't know Roberta was planning to amend the agreement, he said. I want you to know that. I believe you, I said. And I did because my father is not a strategic man. He is a man who accepts the path of least resistance and doesn't always examine where it leads. That is a different thing. He said, I should have called you. About Christmas. About all of it. I let things get arranged around me without asking enough questions. I said, yes. He nodded. He looked tired in the good way, the way a person looks after they've set something down that was heavier than they'd admitted. He hugged me, briefly, in the awkward way fathers who don't hug enough do it, and then he went to find his car. Roberta called me 4 days after the meeting. Once. I let it go to voicemail. The message was careful and professional and said that she hoped we could find a time to talk and that she felt some things needed to be clarified in person. She sounded, in the message, like someone who has been working all weekend on exactly the right tone and is still not sure they've found it. I did not call back. She called again a week later. I let that one go too. My mother told me, the following month, that Roberta was processing a lot and that she hoped the family could find its way to a conversation eventually. I said I was open to that when I felt ready. My mother accepted this with the particular grace she uses when she has understood that she is not in a position to negotiate. Steph sent me a text 3 weeks after the meeting. It said, I didn't know about the amendment. I want you to know that. I'm sorry about Christmas. I texted back, I know. Thank you. Because I did believe her, and because Steph had spent her whole life in the gravitational field of her mother's decisions and had not yet entirely found her own footing outside them. That is a hard thing to do. I had some sympathy for it. In June, I drove to Bellevale on a Sunday morning. I brought pastries from a bakery I like in Kansas City, a box of things Gran had always favored, butter croissants and a fruit tart and 1 almond Danish. Gran was on the front porch when I pulled up. It was warm, early summer, the light soft and direct the way it gets in Missouri in June. She had a cup of coffee and a book open on the side table, and she looked, in the morning light, like a person who is exactly where they intend to be. I sat down in the other porch chair. She poured me coffee from the carafe she'd brought out. We ate the pastries. We talked about the business, the lease renewals that had gone through, a new tenant inquiry on the Grover Street property, a landscaping issue at the Bellevale Commons building that I told her as a professional was being handled incorrectly. She laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind she has when something is exactly what she expected. I asked her when she decided to add the codicil. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. A neighbor walked a dog past. A car went by. The silver maple in the yard, different from the one on Cartwright Street, but the same species, the same spring green, moved lightly in the morning air. When I saw you weren't going to be invited to Christmas, she said. I'd been watching for a while. That was when I knew it had gone far enough. I said, you could have told me. You didn't need to know, she said. You needed to show up. There's a difference. I thought about that for a long time on the drive back to Kansas City. I think about it still. The following Christmas, I went home. Roberta was not there. My father cooked a turkey that he was overly proud of and slightly too dry. My mother made a salad that was better than the turkey. We watched a film after dinner and fell asleep before it ended, the way families do when the occasion has finally been allowed to settle into something ordinary. I called Gran on Christmas morning. She answered on the second ring. She asked about my projects. I asked about the Grover Street inquiry. We talked for 22 minutes. That night, I went downstairs and had a slice of the pie I'd brought Deja because old habits from good years are worth keeping. My grandmother didn't argue with what was happening to me. She didn't call a family meeting or issue an ultimatum or ask anyone to change their behavior. She sat down with an attorney and she wrote one page, and she put it in an envelope, and she let time carry it forward to the moment when it would be needed. She had understood something that I had to learn the slow way, that quiet people don't win by getting louder. They win by doing the permanent work, the work that doesn't need defending because it's already in the record, already witnessed, already real. The people who see you clearly are often the ones who never have to say it out loud. They just make sure, in whatever way they can, that the record reflects the truth. That's my story. A sealed envelope, a conference room in April, and a grandmother who had been paying attention long after everyone assumed she'd stopped. Has someone in your life ever seen you more clearly than your own family did? A neighbor, a mentor, a grandparent, someone who just quietly showed up? Tell me who it was and what they did. Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.